novel coronavirus outbreak was first reported in the Chinese city of Wuhan in December 2019, the one question that has engaged nations, scientists, virologists, epidemiologists, and even the intelligence community the world over has been, what's the source of origin of SARS-CoV-2, the virus that causes COVID-19? Is it a case of the virus spilling over naturally from wildlife to humans? Or did it leak from a lab accidentally? Or was it, as many fear, developed in a Chinese lab as a bioweapon? In this special broadcast, we will examine each theory and its feasibility. But first, how did we get here? In early 2021, a team of independent experts instituted by the World Health Organization visited Wuhan in China to probe the origins of SARS-CoV-2 virus. While the report did not come up with a specific answer to the question, it mentioned the possibility of an accidental leak from a Chinese lab as the least likely scenario.
Did you find anything?
Anything interesting?
Did you find anything inside? Did you find the origins of the coronavirus?
Excellent facilities, very informative pictures.
With no definitive clarity from the WHO team, a group of 18 scientists wrote in an international journal named Science, calling for an inquiry for greater clarity about the origins of the pandemic. Soon, the top infectious disease expert in the US, Anthony Fauci, called for a full investigation into the origin of the virus. The Australian publication dropped a bombshell on 7th May 2021. It published a report carrying explosive revelations in a document with the US State Department. Quoting the publication, UK's Sun newspaper reported that Chinese scientists probed weaponizing coronaviruses 5 years before the COVID-19 pandemic struck and had outlined their ideas in a document that predicted a third world war would be fought with biological weapons. It said that as part of their investigation into the origins of COVID-19, US officials had obtained the paper written by military scientists and senior Chinese public health officials in 2015. According to the document, Chinese scientists described SARS coronaviruses, of which COVID is an example, as heralding a new era of genetic weapons. The Chinese scientists even boasted that the viruses could be artificially manipulated into an emerging human disease virus, then weaponized and unleashed in a way never seen before. Quoting the Australian, The Week reported that the document was titled in Chinese, "The Unnatural Origin of SARS and New Species of Man-Made Viruses as Genetic Bioweapons," and was purportedly written by People's Liberation Army scientists, which it goes on to name. It further quotes the Australian as saying that the document was verified by digital forensics specialist Robert Potter. The Sun reported that other than the sinister prediction by Chinese PLA commanders that World War III would be fought with biological weapons, there are references in the document that a bioweapon attack could cause the enemy's medical system to collapse. China's evident interest in bioweapons, as reflected in the document, raises concerns over whether the virus that causes COVID-19 is indeed a bioweapon developed by Chinese scientists. Veteran journalist and science writer Nicholas Wade explained in an article on bulletin.org why the theory of a leak from a Chinese biolaboratory is a feasible one. Another international publication, US-based Wall Street Journal, put out a report that highlighted the possibility of a leak from a Chinese lab in Wuhan. On 23rd May 2021, this report by the Wall Street Journal, based on a previously undisclosed US intelligence report, made a startling revelation. It revealed that 3 researchers from China's Wuhan Institute of Virology became so sick in November 2019 that they sought hospital care. It quotes David Asher, a former US official who led a State Department task force on the origins of the virus for then Secretary of State Mike Pompeo, as telling a Hudson Institute seminar in March that he doubted that the lab researchers became sick because of the ordinary flu. Asher said I am very doubtful that 3 people in highly protected circumstances in a level 3 laboratory working on coronaviruses would all get sick with influenza that put them in the hospital or in severe conditions all in the same week, and it did not have anything to do with the coronavirus. Adding that the researchers' illness may represent the first known cluster of COVID-19 cases. Both the timing and location mentioned in the report are significant. The first cases of the outbreak were detected in the Huanan seafood market in December 2019. That's a month after researchers from the Wuhan Virology Institute reportedly fell sick, and the institute is not very far from the live animal market. Raising the question, was the virus developed in the Wuhan lab where it infected its researchers and leaked out? Serious questions have been raised on China's lack of transparency from the initial days of the outbreak itself. Li Wenliang, a whistleblowing Chinese doctor who posted a warning on social media in late December 2019 about a cluster of cases of a flu-like disease that he had been treating at his hospital, was pulled up by the police for spreading rumors. He died nearly a month later. The Wuhan Institute has not shared raw data, safety logs and lab records on its extensive work with coronaviruses in bats. As per the WHO probe report, China did not inform the WHO about the outbreak, and only after WHO made a request through official channels to China based on reports that it got from the public domain did Beijing hold its first meeting. Shi Zhengli, the top bat coronavirus expert at the Wuhan Institute of Virology, has claimed that the virus did not leak from her laboratories. She told the WHO-led team that traveled to Wuhan in early 2021 that all staff had tested negative for COVID-19 antibodies and there had been no change of staff on the coronavirus team. But that claim is not supported by evidence. In fact, China refused to hand over key data to WHO team investigating the origins of COVID-19. Members of the WHO-led team said their Chinese counterparts had identified 92 potential COVID-19 cases among some 76,000 people who fell sick between October and early December 2019, but turned down requests to share raw data on the larger group. That data would help the WHO-led team understand why China sought to only test those 92 people for antibodies. Team members also said they asked for access to a Wuhan blood bank to test samples from before December 2019 for antibodies. They say that Chinese authorities declined at first, citing privacy concerns, then agreed, but have yet to provide that access. WHO DG admitted the team of investigators had not adequately examined the lab leak hypothesis. He also called for a fuller probe of the idea. US President Biden's chief medical advisor, Dr. Fauci, has urged China to release medical records of the 3 researchers of Wuhan Institute of Virology who fell ill in November 2019, and the 6 miners who fell ill in 2012 after visiting a bat cave in the southern Chinese province of Yunnan. Dr. Fauci has been under public scrutiny over his email communication with Peter Daszak, head of EcoHealth Alliance that helped fund research on bat coronaviruses in Wuhan Institute of Virology. Questions have been raised over whether he backed Chinese denials of the theory that COVID-19 leaked from a Wuhan lab, but Dr. Fauci maintains there was nothing untoward in the email exchange. The lab leak theory was earlier seen as a conspiracy theory, but it is now attracting the interest of scientists the world over. The lack of transparency by Chinese authorities or lack of conclusive proof for the alternate hypothesis is what concerns the international scientific community. This article by Nicholas Wade for Bulletin.org details why the possibility that the virus may have been created in a lab in a gain-of-function process and accidentally leaked looks plausible. Gain-of-function involves tweaking naturally occurring coronaviruses to make them more infectious so that they can replicate in human cells in a lab, allowing the virus's potential effect on humans to be studied and better understood. Nicholas Wade begins by discrediting strong statements from two scientific groups, saying they were not at first examined as critically as they should have been. In his article, Wade highlights the statement by a group of virologists published in The Lancet on 19 February 2020. We stand together to strongly condemn conspiracy theories suggesting that COVID-19 does not have a natural origin. Wade goes on to make the startling claim. It later turned out that the Lancet letter had been organized and drafted by Peter Daszak, president of the EcoHealth Alliance of New York. Daszak's organization funded coronavirus research at the Wuhan Institute of Virology. If the SARS-CoV-2 virus had indeed escaped from research he funded, Daszak would be potentially culpable. This acute conflict of interest was not declared to the Lancet's readers. To the contrary, the letter concluded, "We declare no competing interests."
Virologists around the world have been able to manipulate viruses and enhance their infectivity. And the reason they try to do this is to predict what's going to happen in nature anyway. And they believe that if they can find out in the lab the sort of 2 or 3 mutations the virus might be capable of taking to cause a pandemic, if they can find this out ahead of time, then they could help predict or prevent an epidemic. That's the theory, at least. And this is the reason why we've had all these experiments going on, many of them quite dangerous in some people's views. So you can see that virologists as a whole have an interest in this not being lab escape. They don't want the public to look too carefully into their safety practices and what they've been doing. And certainly if this virus turns out to have escaped from the lab in Wuhan, they would certainly expect, I think, much closer scrutiny from authorities in almost every country.
The second statement he questions was published on 17 March 2020 in the journal Nature Medicine. It was authored by a group of 5 virologists led by Christian G. Andersen of the Scripps Research Institute. The statement reads, "Our analysis clearly show that SARS-CoV-2 is not a laboratory construct or a purposefully manipulated virus."
2 small groups of virologists, and now the second one from a group headed by Christian Andersen, assured readers that the SARS-CoV-2 virus could not have been manipulated in the lab. And in saying this, they were going well beyond what they could possibly have known was true. In other words, they were assuring the public of something that may or may not have been true. And the reason they couldn't know that the virus had not been manipulated is that there are several ways of manipulating viruses that leave no trace. You can grow the viruses up in what's called serial passage. You pass them from one group of cells to another. The more successful are sort of selected, and that's how a virus can change without anyone seeing any fingerprints of manipulation.
Wade questions the assumption by virologists that since the spike protein of SARS-CoV-2 binds very well to its target, the human ACE2 receptor, therefore the virus must have arisen by natural selection, not manipulation. He says this ignores the way that virologists do in fact get spike proteins to bind to chosen targets, which is not by calculation, but by splicing in spike protein genes from other viruses or by serial passage. Wade writes, the author's second argument against manipulation is even more contrived.
Dr. Andersen and his co-authors had 2 reasons why, in their view, the virus could not have been manipulated. And the second one was that anyone trying to manipulate a virus would use one of the standard viral backbones that have been described in the literature. And since no such backbone is evident in SARS-CoV-2, therefore no one could have manipulated its genome in this way. But in fact, these backbones are quite easy to make. So an obvious possibility is that people had made a backbone that they had not reported in the scientific literature and used that to manipulate the virus. So once again, their reasoning was far from conclusive.
Referring to the WHO team's probe in China, Wade writes, the Chinese had no evidence to offer the Commission in support of the natural emergence theory.
Natural emergence is a plausible scenario for the origin of SARS-CoV-2 because two previous viruses, SARS-1 and MERS, have emerged in this way. But when they did so, both those earlier viruses left numerous traces in the environment. In the case of SARS-1, we know the bat population from which the original virus came. We know the intermediate host animal, civets, so animals that are eaten in Chinese wet markets, and we can see the mutations in the virus itself as it adapted first from bats to civets, and then from civets to humans, becoming first a mild pathogen and then a very serious pathogen. So altogether, we can see something like 25 crucial mutations in the SARS-1 virus as it became a serious epidemic. So at first, people favoring natural emergence assumed that very quickly they would find similar evidence, similar traces in the environment for SARS-CoV-2. Yet as each month has passed, no such evidence has emerged. And indeed, when the World Health Organization Commission went to Beijing in February 2020, even though they declared that lab escape was very unlikely and paid no attention to it, in fact, what was very visible was that the Chinese authorities had not a shred of evidence to offer the WHO Commission in favor of natural emergence. Their hands were empty, despite what we assume was a very intensive search.
Then Wade addresses the next logical question. Why would anyone want to create a novel virus capable of causing a pandemic?
So for the last 10, 15 years, virologists have learned how to manipulate viruses in considerable detail. And in terms of coronaviruses, they are particularly interested in the spike proteins that jut out from the surface of the virus, because the spike proteins determine what host animal the virus can attack. So they have been able to do many quite remarkable things. For example, some Dutch virologists took a coronavirus that infects mice, and by manipulating its spike proteins, they made the virus able to attack only cats. So this was an interesting demonstration of their power, and this line of research has been pursued ever since by people who study coronaviruses, and in particular, Dr. Zhengli Shi, the chief Chinese expert on coronaviruses, was swapping spike proteins around from the many new bat viruses she had gathered in the caves of Wuhan. And this, of course, is just the kind of procedure that could have led to the creation of a virus such as SARS-CoV-2.
Wade makes another startling revelation that makes the lab leak theory appear more plausible. He says that China's leading expert on bat viruses, Shi Zhengli, or Bat Lady, who mounted frequent expeditions to the bat-infested caves of Yunnan in southern China and collected around 100 different bat coronaviruses, had teamed up with Ralph C. Barrick, an eminent coronavirus researcher at the University of North Carolina. Their work focused on enhancing the ability of bat viruses to attack humans so as to examine the emergence potential of circulating bat coronaviruses to infect humans.
Dr. Zhengli Shi, the leading Chinese coronavirus virologist, worked for some time with Dr. Ralph Barrick, who is the leading coronavirologist in the United States. And together they performed a very interesting experiment which alarmed them and many other people. They took the spike protein from one coronavirus and put it into the genome of another and found they had created a novel virus that was capable of infecting human cells. So this occasioned a considerable debate about whether such experiments should go forward or not. Now, Dr. Barrick and Dr. Shi argued that, sure, there were risks, but those could be contained and that the benefits outweighed the risk. And most virologists accepted that argument, and on that basis, research along these lines went ahead, despite a moratorium issued by the US federal government that lasted from 2014 to 2017.
He further writes about what happened inside the Wuhan Institute of Virology.
So after Dr. Shi had learned from Dr. Barrick the technique of transferring spike proteins from one coronavirus genome to another, she went back to her lab in Wuhan and continued these experiments. Now, this we know in part because she had a grant to do so from the US National Institutes of Health. And the abstract of her grant describes how she would use the tools of genetics to test out, to transfer spike proteins and to test out these novel viruses in cultures of human cells and in humanized mice. Now, humanized mice are mice that have been genetically engineered to carry the same proteins as humans have on the surface of the cells of their airways. So these are a very good stand-in for humans. Of course, it would be unethical to test these viruses on humans, so these humanized mice are very convenient. The thing is, if you use humanized mice, your viruses are soon going to adapt to this new environment and are going to be very good at attacking human cells. And this might explain, if indeed the virus did escape from Dr. Shi's lab, this would explain the otherwise a very remarkable fact that from the very beginning, SARS-CoV-2 was very good at attacking human cells. The SARS-1 virus took a long time to become an efficient attacker of human cells because it had to go through all these changes. And you would expect SARS-2 to have traveled a similar journey, but no, right from the beginning, it could attack human cells very well, and this may have been because it was grown in humanized mice.
Wade deduces that it cannot yet be stated that she did or did not generate SARS-CoV-2 in her lab because her records have been sealed, but it seems she was certainly on the right track to have done so. The other question he addresses is around the safety arrangements at the Wuhan Institute of Virology.
There are 4 levels of laboratory safety, and they're designated BSL 1, 2, 3, and 4. So BSL 4 is what you use for seriously dangerous pathogens like Ebola, and all the other levels are much lower. So it's true that the State Department was concerned about the safety standards of the new BSL 4 lab that has been built by the French at the Wuhan Institute of Virology. They sent back cables saying that this was not being run in an adequate way. However, we know that all of Dr. Shi's experiments with coronaviruses took place at the much lower levels of BSL-2 and BSL-3. So BSL-2 doesn't require you to do very much. You just wear a lab coat and gloves, and you work under a hood, and you put a notice on the door saying biohazard. It's about the same safety level as you'd find in a dentist's office. Now, Dr. Shi was obeying the same international rules as other virologists use for working with coronaviruses. But nonetheless, what these rules seem to overlook is that if you are manipulating coronaviruses at BSL-2 levels and you happen to create a virus that is much more infectious than you expect, then the virus has a very good chance of infecting a lab worker and escaping from the lab.
UK-based publication The Daily Mail reported yet another explosive study. It published findings by 2 researchers that COVID-19 was created by Chinese scientists who tried to cover their tracks with retroengineering to make it seem like the virus naturally arose from bats. On 28 May 2021, the Daily Mail reported findings from a research paper authored by British professor Angus Dalgleish and Norwegian scientist Dr. Birger Sorensen. The two scientists revealed in the paper that while analyzing COVID-19 samples in an attempt to create a vaccine, they had discovered unique fingerprints in the virus that they say could only have arisen from manipulation in a laboratory. They wrote that they had prima facie evidence of retroengineering in China for a year, but were ignored by academics and major journals. They pieced together how Chinese scientists, some working in concert with American universities, allegedly built the tools to create the coronavirus. Much of the work was centered around controversial gain-of-function research temporarily outlawed in the US under the Obama administration. Dalgleish and Sorensen claimed that scientists working on gain-of-function projects took a natural coronavirus backbone found in Chinese cave bats and spliced onto it a new spike, turning it into the deadly and highly transmissible SARS-CoV-2.
There has been a big change in public opinion about how this virus originated. So for the last year and a half, the mainstream media, other institutions have just assumed that natural emergence was the obvious way and that lab escape was very unlikely. But overnight, that opinion has changed for various reasons. And I think that means that for the first time, considerable pressure will grow on the Chinese to stop stonewalling and provide the information that they have locked up so far, and to cooperate with the rest of the world in trying to understand what happened and make sure that a terrible pandemic like this never happens again. So if enough countries, if scientists in enough countries say, well, on present evidence, lab leak seems more likely, I think that will generate such pressure. And the Chinese may decide that it would be better to cooperate with the rest of the world than to become a pariah for the foreseeable future.
UK-based newspaper Sunday Times reported that British intelligence agencies believe it is feasible that the COVID-19 pandemic began with a coronavirus leak from a Chinese biolaboratory, and that it no longer thought that there was only a remote chance of a leak. The three possibilities of natural progression from wildlife to humans, an accidental lab leak, and the use of the SARS-CoV-2 virus as a biological weapon remain and need further probing and additional corroboration. Thanks for watching.